The chipped formica of the diner booth felt cold under Leo Maxwell's elbows. Rain lashed against the window, blurring the pre-dawn gray of the Seattle skyline into an indistinct smear. He hadn't bothered with coffee. The lukewarm tea sat untouched, a film already forming on the surface. He preferred the dull ache of exhaustion to any artificial lift. It was a familiar companion. He traced the faded photograph with a callous fingertip. Clara Hemmings, 17, vanished from the Bainbridge Island ferry nearly 30 years ago. The picture, a grainy school portrait, showed a girl with a shy smile and eyes that held a universe of unspoken dreams. Now, just a ghost in a file. The case file itself lay open before him, the paper brittle with age. Leo hadn't been assigned the Hemmings disappearance. It was a cold case, a tangle of dead ends and unanswered questions. Relegated to the basement archives of the Seattle PD he'd chosen. He'd been sifting through the forgotten, the lost, for the past 2 years temid a self-imposed penance, a desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of order from the chaos that had consumed his life. He'd started with missing persons. They seemed quieter, less resistant to the weight of his failures. Homicide felt too raw, too close to the screaming silence he carried within him. The smell of salt and diesel hung heavy in the air, even here miles from the waterfront. Seattle's ferry terminals were a world unto themselves, so many transit hubs, steeped in melancholy. They were places of arrivals and departures, of hopeful reunions and silent goodbyes. Places where people disappeared. Leo knew that intimately. He remembered standing on a similar terminal. The Bremerton ferry this time, waiting for Amelia. Her bright yellow raincoat a beacon in the drizzle. She'd been coming home from a conference. He'd promised himself he'd be there, promise him I thought he'd be there. One phone call, a sudden storm, a delayed departure, he'd driven faster, much faster. He'd convinced himself he could beat the weather, beat fate. A jagged tear escaped his memory and traced a path down his cheek. He swiped it away with the back of his hand, tasting salt and something metallic. He hadn't cried like that in months, not openly. The grief had calcified, settled into a heavy weight in his chest. He pushed the photograph aside and scanned the case file again. The initial investigation had been messy. A brief flurry of activity followed by dwindling leads and a growing sense of hopelessness. Clara had been last seen near the railing on the port side, heading toward the lower deck. No witnesses, no sign of struggle, no body. The possibility of suicide had been considered, but Clara's friends and family vehemently dismissed it. She was a good student, a talented artist, and had recently been accepted to a prestigious art school. She was looking forward to her future. Leo ran a hand through his thinning hair. He'd seen enough darkness to know that despair often masked itself in the guise of optimism. And the ferry offered an easy escape, a dark, indifferent sea to swallow secrets whole. He glanced at the handwritten notes from the original detective. A man named Karras, possible elopement, one note read. Boyfriend questioned, alibi verified. Another, rumors of a disagreement with her father, financial issues, dead ends, all of them. He reread the witness statement, searching for a detail, a discrepancy. Anything that might have been overlooked, the details were frustratingly scant. People tended to be preoccupied on ferries, lost in their own thoughts, watching the water rush past. The file mentioned a peculiar item Clara was known to wear, a silver necklace with a small, intricately carved raven pendant. Her mother had reported it missing along with Clara. It hadn't been recovered. Leo leaned back, the diner's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The fog was rolling in now, thick and spectral, obscuring the ferries at the dock. It wasn't unusual for this time of year, but it amplified the sense of isolation, of being adrift in a gray, watery void. He felt a strange pull toward this case, a resonance that disturbed him. He'd worked dozens of cold cases, but this one felt different. It was as if Clara's story was somehow intertwined with his own, a reflection of his lingering guilt and unanswered questions. He'd lost his wife, Amelia, on a rain-slicked highway 2 years ago, a drunk driver, a moment of inattention, a lifetime of regret. The official report called it an accident. Leo called it his failure. He should have been there. He should have protected her. He'd briefly considered the possibility that Amelia's death wasn't an accident. He'd even started his own, unofficial investigation, but it had led nowhere, only to more pain and a growing sense of desperation. He'd shelved it, buried it under layers of bureaucratic paperwork and forced indifference. The Hemmings case wasn't about justice anymore. Not really. It was about finding something, towing anything to fill the void, to silence the ghosts that haunted him. It was about proving to himself that he could still see the lost, even if he couldn't bring them back. He finished his lukewarm tea, the bitter taste doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He gathered the file, his movements slow and deliberate. He needed to be at the ferry terminal. He needed to walk the deck, to feel the rhythm of the sea, to try and understand what had happened to Clara Hemmings. The terminal was almost deserted when he arrived, swallowed by the thickening fog. Visibility was down to a few hundred feet. The air was heavy with moisture, clinging to his skin like a shroud. The mournful wail of a ferry horn echoed across the water, a lonely sound that amplified the sense of desolation. He walked onto the ferry, the sooty Kitsap, the same class of vessel that had been in service 30 years ago. He imagined Clara Hemmings standing near the railing on this very deck, looking out at the gray expanse of Puget Sound. He walked toward the port side, his eyes scanning the metal railings, the weathered wood, the scuffed deck plates. He tried to see what she might have seen, to feel what she might have felt. The cold spray of the sea, the wind in her hair, the sense of freedom and anticipation. Or perhaps the growing dread, the chilling realization that she wasn't alone. He found himself drawn to a secluded alcove near the stern of the ship, a shadowy corner overlooked by most passengers. He could almost picture her standing there, hidden from view. He ran his hand over the cold metal railing. That is when he saw her, a woman stumbling toward the ticket booth looking utterly disoriented. She was dressed in clothes that were too thin for the weather, her hair plastered to her forehead with rain. She moved with a hesitant, unsteady gait as if unsure of her own footing. She reached the ticket booth, clutching her head. I don't know where I am," she mumbled to the attendant. Her voice barely a whisper. "I don't remember anything." The attendant, a young woman with bored eyes, sighed and started to ask questions. Leo barely heard her. His attention was riveted on the silver chain around the woman's neck, a silver chain holding a small, intricately carved raven pendant. It was identical to the one described in the Hemmings file. The same delicate details, the same subtle curve of the wings. His breath hitched in his throat. He took a step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't felt this jolt of adrenaline, this raw, primal alertness, in years. Could it be, after all this time? He pushed through the small crowd that had gathered around the woman, his eyes fixed on the pendant. He needed to get closer. He needed to see. As he approached, the woman looked up, her eyes meeting his. They were wide and vacant, filled with a terrifying emptiness. And for a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition crossed her face. A spark of something lost, something forgotten. Then she screamed. A long, primal scream that pierced the fog and shattered the fragile peace of the ferry terminal. A scream that echoed Leo's own silent anguish and promised something terrible was about to begin. The scream ripped through the terminal, momentarily silencing the rhythmic thrum of the ferry engines and the mournful cry of the gulls. Heads turned, eyes widened. Leo instinctively reached for the woman, bracing himself against the wave of panic that radiated from her. Hey, it is okay," he said, his voice a low rumble designed to soothe, though he wasn't sure he was succeeding. "You're safe." She was trembling violently, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. She didn't seem to register his presence, her gaze fixed on some unseen horror. I don't know who I am," she repeated, her voice a fractured whisper. "I don't remember anything." The terminal security guard, a burly man named Davies, arrived, pushing his way through the small gathering of onlookers. "Everything all right here. She has amnesia, I think," Leo said, holding up a hand to forestall Davies. "She is disoriented, clearly in distress." Davies regarded the woman with a skeptical eye. "Happens sometimes, tourist seasickness. We get all sorts." He glanced at Leo. "You with her?" "No," Leo replied. "I just saw her struggling." He flashed his badge, a reflex honed from years on the force. "It usually smoothed things over," Davies grunted. "All right, let's get her somewhere warm." Then we'll call an ambulance. Leo knew an ambulance would mean a barrage of questions she couldn't answer, a system that wouldn't understand. He hesitated. Let me stay with her for a bit, if you don't mind. I have some experience with trauma. He omitted the specific kind of trauma he knew. Davy shrugged. Suit yourself. But I'll need a statement from you both. They guided her to a small waiting area, offering her a bottle of water which she took with trembling hands. Leo sat across from her, observing her closely. She couldn't be older than 25, with delicate features and a cascade of dark, tangled hair. Her clothes were simple. Unremarkable suine, a worn denim jacket, a gray sweater, jeans. Nothing that offered a clue to her identity. He noticed again the necklace, the silver raven gleaming faintly in the dim light. He subtly angled his body, trying to get a better look without appearing intrusive. It was identical to the one pictured in Clara Hemming's file. The same intricate carving, the same delicate chain. A coincidence? It felt impossible. Can you tell me anything at all? Leo asked gently. Anything you remember? A name, a place, a face. She closed her eyes. Her brow furrowed in concentration. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. Water, she breathed, her voice barely audible. Cold, so cold, and someone shouting. Her body jerked as if reliving a painful memory. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clenching into fists. A struggle, I can't. A brief flash of images flickered across her face, a blurred figure looming over her, a hand reaching out the dark, swirling water of the Puget Sound. Then it was gone, leaving her staring blankly ahead, lost in the labyrinth of her own mind. It is okay, Leo repeated, his voice softer this time. You don't have to force it. Just relax. He excused himself and went to find Davies, needing a moment to gather his thoughts to confirm what he already suspected. Davies, he said, showing him a photograph from the Hemmings file. Have you ever seen this necklace before? Specifically, on anyone matching her description? Davies squinted at the image. Can't say I have. We see a lot of jewelry come through here. Tourists, you know? Leo didn't press it. He knew Davies wouldn't remember. He needed something concrete. Something to tie her to the case. He ran a quick check on the woman's fingerprints through the state database. Nothing. No matches, no criminal record, no trace of her existence before today. It was as if she'd simply materialized out of the fog. He expanded the search, checking missing persons reports, unidentified bodies. Still nothing. It was unsettling, bordering on impossible. The digital silence screamed at him. Back in the waiting area, the woman was staring out the window, her gaze unfocused. He sat beside her again. Do you see anything familiar? He asked, gesturing towards the swirling gray outside. She shook her head slowly. Just fog, it feels like it is inside my head. He decided to try a different approach. He started asking seemingly innocuous questions, hoping to trigger a forgotten memory. What is your favorite color? No response. What kind of music do you like? Silence. Do you have any family friends? Her eyes filled with tears. I think I did. But I can't see their faces. They're fading. He noticed a small, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. As she fiddled with the necklace, her sleeve rode up, revealing a glimpse of her inner wrist. He saw a tattoo, small, faded, almost obscured by the pale skin. He leaned closer, trying to make out the ink. Coordinates. Leo's blood ran cold. He subtly maneuvered to get a clear view, memorizing the numbers. They weren't local. They pointed to a remote stretch of coastline in British Columbia, a rugged, sparsely populated area known for its treacherous currents and hidden coves. He needed to know more. He needed to understand the connection between this woman, the necklace, the cold case, and those coordinates. He spent the next few hours interviewing passengers who had been on the ferry when the woman boarded. The accounts were frustratingly inconsistent. She looked lost, kind of scared, said a middle-aged man in a business suit. She was mumbling to herself. I thought she was talking on a Bluetooth headset. I didn't notice her specifically, said a young woman with bright pink hair. It was pretty crowded. Lots of tourists. She was arguing with someone on her phone, claimed an elderly woman with a sharp gaze. I heard her say something about a debt and a warning. The conflicting testimonies only deepened the mystery. It was as if the woman had been deliberately obscured, erased from the memories of those who had seen her. The ferry crew were equally unhelpful. No one remembered seeing her before she arrived at the terminal, and no one had reported anything unusual. Leo felt a growing sense of urgency. He was running out of time. The woman's memories, fragile as they were, seemed to be slipping away, and he had the unsettling feeling that someone somewhere was looking for her. He returned to the waiting area, hoping to find some new clue, some forgotten detail. The woman was asleep, her head resting against the back of the chair. Her expression was peaceful, but her brow was furrowed in concentration, as if she were still battling the demons within her mind. He sat beside her, watching her sleep, his mind racing. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this woman wasn't just another amnesiac. She was a key, a missing piece of a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. Suddenly, she gasped, her eyes snapping open. She sat bolt upright, her body rigid with fear. "Victor," she screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Victor." The name hung in the air, a chilling echo in the otherwise silent room. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped forward, unconscious. Leo caught her before she hit the ground. As he gently lowered her to the chair, he noticed something else. Her sleeve had ridden up again, fully revealing the tattoo on her wrist. This time he saw it clearly. The coordinates weren't just numbers. They were accompanied by a single, faded word etched beneath them in tiny, almost illegible letters. "Remember, 1ID." The coordinates burned in Leo's memory. A cryptic message from a woman who didn't know who she was. He'd spent the last 4 hours navigating bureaucratic roadblocks, subtly pushing Davies aside, and securing a warrant to investigate the location they indicated. His captain, Reynolds, hadn't been pleased. "Maxwell, you're chasing shadows," Reynolds had growled, his face red with frustration. "A decades-old cold case and a woman with amnesia. It is a waste of resources. I need you back on active duty, not playing detective on some wild goose chase." Leo had held his ground, citing a potential connection to an ongoing investigation, fingering a half-truth, but enough to appease Reynolds for now. He knew Reynolds was under pressure from higher-ups to close the Hemmings case for good. Some secrets were better left buried, it seemed. The coordinates led him to a secluded cove on the western shore of Bainbridge Island, a short ferry ride from Seattle. The area was remote, accessible only by boat or a winding, overgrown trail. The air smelled of salt, pine, and damp earth. He found the boathouse tucked away in a small clearing, half hidden by a tangle of blackberry bushes and weathered driftwood. It was dilapidated, the wood gray and rotting, the windows boarded up. It felt abandoned for a long time. The padlock on the door had been rusted through, easily broken. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the smell of decay. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The boathouse was larger than it appeared from the outside, a cavernous space crammed with nautical equipment. Tangled fishing nets, rusted winches, stacks of old nautical charts, and a collection of unsettling artifacts. He saw remnants of old ropes, stained dark red in patches, and a scattering of corroded metal tools. He started with the charts. They were meticulously detailed, covering the waters around Puget Sound and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Many were annotated with handwritten notes, marking specific locations, currents, and depths. He paid particular attention to the charts dated around the time of Clara Hemming's disappearance. He found several locations circled in red ink, accompanied by cryptic symbols he didn't recognize. They weren't standard navigational markers. They felt deliberate, calculated. He spent hours meticulously examining each chart, piecing together a fragmented map of someone's clandestine activities. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just a place to store fishing gear. This was a hub for something else, something illicit. He discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, concealed beneath a layer of rotting wood. Inside, he found a waterproof container filled with old documents, logbooks, and photographs. The logbooks were written in a coded script, but Leo recognized some recurring names and phrases. One name stood out, Victor. It was the name the woman had screamed. The photographs were more disturbing. They showed a group of men loading packages onto a small boat under the cover of darkness. The packages appeared to be neatly wrapped, and the men were carefully concealing their faces. But one photograph was different. It was a candid shot taken from a distance, showing Victor clearly. The man in the photograph was handsome, charismatic, with a predatory glint in his eyes. And Leo recognized him instantly. Julian Vance, a prominent local businessman, a philanthropist, a pillar of the community. He owned a chain of luxury hotels and resorts throughout the Pacific Northwest. He was untouchable. Leo's gut twisted. Could Vance be involved in Clara Hemming's disappearance? It seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was mounting. He needed to talk to someone who had been involved in the original investigation. He remembered the name Karras, the lead detective on the Hemmings case. He'd retired years ago, moved to a small town on the Olympic Peninsula. He found Karras living a quiet life, tending a small garden and spending his days fishing. The years had taken their toll. Karras was frail, his memory patchy, his eyes clouded with regret. "Clara Hemmings," Karras repeated, his voice a raspy whisper. "That case, it stayed with me. A beautiful girl. Gone without a trace." Leo showed him the photograph of Julian Vance. "Do you recognize this man?" Karras squinted at the image, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Vance, Julian Vance. Yes, I remember him. He was helpful. Donated a significant amount of money to the police foundation shortly after Clara disappeared." "Helpful how?" Leo pressed. He offered information. A tip about a possible sighting. It turned out to be a dead end. Karras paused, his eyes losing focus. "I always felt like something wasn't right, like we were being steered in a certain direction. But I couldn't put my finger on it." "Did you investigate Vance further?" Karras shook his head. "No. He was a powerful man, and the pressure to close the case was intense. We had no concrete evidence, just a feeling." Leo sensed Karras was holding back something. He pressed him again. But the old detective became increasingly agitated. "I've said all I can say," Karras snapped, his voice trembling. "Leave it alone, son. Some things are better left forgotten." Leo respected the old man's reluctance, but it only fueled his suspicion. He thanked Karras and left, feeling more determined than ever to uncover the truth. As he drove back to Seattle, his phone rang. It was Reynolds. "Maxwell," Reynolds said, his voice clipped and cold. "I've been getting complaints. Your superiors are concerned about your unorthodox methods. You're ordered to cease all investigation into the Hemmings case immediately." "With all due respect, Captain, I'm close to a breakthrough," Leo said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "That is not your concern. Your concern is following orders. I'm giving you one last chance. Drop it, Maxwell, or face the consequences." Leo knew Reynolds wasn't bluffing. His career was on the line, but he couldn't ignore what he'd found. He couldn't turn his back on Clara Hemmings. Not now. He'd pulled over to the side of the road, his mind racing. He needed to find a way to continue the investigation without tipping off Reynolds or Vance. He needed to work outside the system, to operate in the shadows. He glanced at the photograph of Julian Vance, a cold dread creeping into his heart. He had stumbled onto something dangerous, something that reached the highest echelons of power, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was being watched. He returned to the boathouse, hoping to find another clue hidden amidst the nautical clutter. He focused his attention on the waterproof container, carefully examining each document buried beneath the logbooks. He found a small, weathered journal. The pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with a cramped, spidery handwriting. It was a detailed account of a smuggling operation, a network of illicit activities that spanned the Pacific Northwest. The journal described the transport of illegal goods, thieving drugs, weapons, stolen art TVI'd across the border, using the remote coves of Bainbridge Island as a staging ground. And Victor was at the center of it all, orchestrating the operation with ruthless efficiency. Leo felt a surge of adrenaline. He'd connected too many dots to turn back now. He turned to the last page of the journal. A single faded photograph was tucked inside. It was a picture of a young woman with long dark hair, her face partially obscured by shadow. But even in the dim light, Leo recognized her eyes. They were the same eyes staring back at him from the photograph of Clara Hemmings. And written on the back of the photo, in the same spidery handwriting, "Fuishi knew too much." The rain returned with a vengeance, mirroring the storm brewing inside Leo, Julian Vance, or Victor, as he was known in the cryptic world laid bare by the boathouse journal Thuan. wasn't just a businessman. He was a predator, a puppeteer pulling strings from the shadows. Leo initiated surveillance on Vance, meticulously documenting his movements. Vance's public persona was impeccable: 30 galas, board meetings, smiling photo opportunities. But beneath the veneer of respectability, Leo uncovered a network of illicit activity: shell corporations, offshore accounts, and whispered connections to organized crime. Vance wasn't just involved, he was in the infrastructure. He discovered Vance had a reputation for ruthlessly silencing his opponents. Several businessmen who had crossed him had met with unfortunate accidents: sue bankruptcies, smear campaigns, even disappearances. The pattern was chillingly consistent. Meanwhile, the woman, still officially listed as Jane Doe, remained in a secure, undisclosed location arranged by a sympathetic contact at the hospital. Her fragmented memories were slowly returning, but they were chaotic, horrifying. Flashing lights, a scream, the smell of salt. She'd whisper during therapy sessions. He was always watching. He had cold eyes. She'd sometimes clutch her head, crying out in pain, reliving moments she couldn't articulate. The raven pendant was always in her hand, a tangible link to a past she couldn't grasp. Leo felt a desperate need to protect her, to shield her from the forces that had robbed her of her identity. The pressure ratcheted up. Two men in expensive suits showed up at Leo's apartment, offering him a friendly warning. They didn't threaten him directly, but the message was clear: back off, let it go. "You're a good detective, Maxwell," one of the men said, his voice smooth and menacing. "Don't waste your career on a lost cause. Some things are best left alone." Leo didn't respond. He simply stared them down, his expression unreadable. He knew this was just the beginning. Vance wasn't going to let him poke around in his affairs without a fight. Then came the news about old man Hemmings. Clara's father, Thomas Hemmings, had been found dead in his workshop. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but Leo smelled a cover-up. Hemmings had been a frail man, but he'd been in relatively good health. And he'd been quietly reinvestigating his daughter's disappearance in recent months, asking questions that Vance clearly didn't want answered. Leo visited the scene, a small, cluttered workshop filled with wood shavings and the scent of varnish. The place had been secured by local police. But Leo knew how these things worked. Evidence could be overlooked, narratives could be shaped. He noticed a small, almost invisible scratch on the floorboards, as if something heavy had been dragged across them. He also found a torn piece of paper hidden beneath a pile of wood shavings. It was a fragment of a handwritten note, containing only a single sentence: "They know about the island." The island, Bainbridge Island, the location of the boathouse. Leo felt a surge of anger and despair. Vance was escalating, systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat. He was playing a dangerous game, and Leo was determined to stop him. He returned to the precinct, ignoring Reynolds' increasingly hostile glares. He needed to find more evidence, something concrete that would link Vance directly to Clara Hemmings' disappearance and the smuggling operation. He revisited the files on Vance, digging deeper into his financial records, his business dealings, his personal life. He discovered a pattern of suspicious transactions, large sums of money being funneled through offshore accounts. He also found a series of encrypted emails sent to and from untraceable addresses. He spent hours trying to decrypt the emails, using every tool at his disposal. Finally, he cracked one of the codes. The message was short and cryptic: "Meeting point confirmed, ferry schedule adjusted, Nightingale protocol activated." Ferrysol's blood ran cold. He referenced the ferry schedule with the coordinates from the woman's tattoo. The coordinates aligned with a specific location on the Kitsap, the very ferry where he'd first found her. He glanced at the clock. The Kitsap was scheduled to make another run to Bainbridge Island in less than an hour. A new fear gripped him. Was Vance planning something? Was he using the ferry to transport something, Suine or someone? Was Jane Doe somehow involved? He raced to the ferry terminal, arriving just as the Kitsap was preparing to depart. He requested a full security sweep of the vessel. Citing a vague threat, Reynolds predictably refused. "You're overreacting, Maxwell," Reynolds barked into the phone. "There is no reason to disrupt ferry service based on your wild speculation." Leo ignored him. He knew he couldn't rely on Reynolds. He was on his own. He boarded the Kitsap and began a covert search of the vessel, focusing on the areas indicated by the coordinates from Jane Doe's tattoo, a secluded storage compartment near the engine room. The compartment was locked. He forced it open, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he found a small, waterproof satchel. He opened it and pulled out a bundle of neatly folded papers. They were coded messages, similar to the ones he'd decrypted from Vance's emails. But among the messages, he found something else. A crumpled piece of paper, a hastily scribbled note. It was addressed to V and contained a single chilling sentence. "The nightingale sings tonight. The package is secured. Eliminate the witness." The witness, he looked around, feeling a prickle of fear on the back of his neck. He wasn't just protecting Jane Doe anymore. He was the witness, and Vance knew he was getting too close. He quickly photographed the documents, then carefully repacked the satchel. He had enough. He needed to get this information to someone he could trust. As he turned to leave, he heard a voice behind him. "Looking for something, detective?" He spun around to face a tall, imposing man in a dark suit, his face obscured by shadow. The man was flanked by two equally menacing figures. They were Vance's enforcers. "Just admiring the engine room," Leo said, trying to sound casual. The man smirked. "Don't play coy, detective. We know what you're doing." And Mr. Vance is not pleased. He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with menace. "He suggests you reconsider your involvement in this matter." For your own sake, Leo braced himself for a confrontation. But before he could react, his radio crackled to life. "Maxwell," Reynolds' voice was urgent. "Report to the bridge immediately. We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" Leo asked. "Jane Doe is missing." The blood drained from Leo's face. Jane Doe missing. It was impossible. He'd ensured her security, or so he thought. A cold dread coiled in his gut, confirming his worst fears. Vance wasn't just eliminating witnesses. He was actively weaponizing the situation. He shoved past Vance's enforcers, ignoring their menacing growls, and sprinted towards the passenger decks. He radioed Reynolds, demanding an immediate lockdown of the ferry, but his pleas were met with bureaucratic inertia. "Maxwell, I told you to stand down." "You're creating unnecessary panic," Reynolds' voice crackled with exasperation. Leo slammed his fist against the radio, cutting off the transmission. He was on his own. Again he found her quickly, or rather he found evidence of her forced removal. Her room was empty, the bed stripped bare, a single silver raven pendant lay abandoned on the pillow rage. Cold and sharp surged through him. He followed a trail of subtle disturbances, hurried footprint on the polished floor, a slightly ajar door fuddy, leading him towards the lower decks. The service corridors that snaked beneath the main passenger areas. He rounded a corner and found them. Victor Vance, standing in the dimly lit corridor, holding Jane Doe at gunpoint. His two enforcers were positioned to block any escape. Jane Doe's eyes were wide with terror, but there was a flicker of recognition in them, a spark of defiance. "Detective Maxwell," Vance said, his voice dripping with condescension. "So predictable, always the hero, aren't you?" "Let her go, Vance," Leo said. His voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He slowly raised his weapon, keeping it aimed at Vance's chest. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Vance replied, his grip tightening on Jane Doe's arm. "She knows too much, and you, detective, have become a liability. She is just a victim," Leo retorted. Vance laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "A victim? Oh, she is far more than that. She was my most valuable asset until she developed a conscience." Jane Doe, her voice trembling but resolute, interjected, "I saw what you were doing, Victor. The smuggling, the intimidation, the bodies. I couldn't be a part of it anymore." Suddenly, memories flooded back to her, a torrent of fragmented images coalescing into a horrifying whole. Her real name wasn't Jane Doe. It was Isabella Rossi. She'd been Victor's accountant responsible for laundering millions of dollars through his offshore accounts. She'd discovered the extent of his operation, the dark underbelly of his empire, and had tried to expose him. That is when he tried to silence her, staging her disappearance, attempting to make it look like a suicide. The ferry had been the original planned location, a carefully orchestrated accident. "You were a fool to trust me, Isabella," Vance said, his voice laced with venom. "You should have stayed in your lane." The enforcers moved in, attempting to flank Leo. He fired a warning shot, sending them scrambling for cover. A brief chaotic struggle ensued, a desperate scramble for control in the cramped confines of the corridor. Leo managed to disarm one of the enforcers, sending him sprawling against the bulkhead. The other one lunged at him, a knife flashing in his hand. Leo ducked, narrowly avoiding the blade, and countered with a swift kick to the man's chest, sending him stumbling backwards. He turned his attention back to Vance, who was still holding Isabella hostage. Vance's eyes were burning with a fanatical intensity. "This ends now," Maxwell Vance snarled. "You've ruined everything." "It ended when you started ruining people's lives," Leo replied, his voice tight with anger. Vance raised his gun, aiming it directly at Isabella's head. Leo knew he had only a split second to react. He lunged forward, attempting to disarm Vance, but Vance was quicker. He fired. The bullet grazed Leo's arm, sending a searing pain through his shoulder. He stumbled backwards, momentarily stunned. "You should have stayed out of this, detective," Vance shouted, his voice echoing through the corridor. Before Leo could recover, Vance shoved Isabella with brutal force. She screamed as she tumbled backwards, plunging over the railing of the open deck. The salt spray, the icy water, the horrifying realization she was falling into the dark, churning depths of Puget Sound. But as Isabella fell, something else surfaced in Leo's mind. A fragment of a memory buried deep within his subconscious. A conversation overheard, a whispered threat, a connection he'd missed for years. He remembered his wife, Amelia, her suspicions about Vance's business dealings, her quiet investigation into his activities, her promise to expose him. And then the car crash, the slick road, the sudden swerve, the overwhelming sense of dread. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a deliberate act of sabotage, orchestrated by Vance to silence Amelia. Rage consumed him, eclipsing the pain in his arm. Vance, seeing the fury in Leo's eyes, turned to flee. He pushed past the remaining enforcer and sprinted towards the upper decks, hoping to reach the bridge and take control of the ferry. Leo, ignoring the agony in his shoulder, pursued him relentlessly, weaving through the labyrinthine corridors of the lower decks. He finally cornered Vance on the car deck, the engines throbbing around them. "You killed my wife," Leo roared, his voice raw with grief and fury. Vance sneered, "Collateral damage, detective, just business." A final, brutal fight ensued. Leo, fueled by adrenaline and vengeance, fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He tackled Vance to the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. The enforcer, recovering from the earlier blow, attempted to intervene, but Leo quickly disabled him with a precise strike. As he was restraining Vance, he saw Isabella struggling in the water, clinging to a piece of debris. The ferry was moving quickly, pulling her further and further away. He had a choice to make: save Isabella or stop Vance from escaping, potentially allowing him to harm others. The weight of the decision threatened to crush him. His gaze flickered between Isabella's desperate face and Vance's defiant eyes. He tightened his grip on Vance, his knuckles white. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his voice a guttural whisper. The ferry horn blared, a mournful cry echoing across the water. It was too late to save Isabella. He'd made his choice. He could only hope it was the right one. The metallic tang of blood filled Leo's nostrils. He tasted it on his lip, a grim reminder of the ferocity of the struggle. Victor Vance lay pinned beneath him, gasping for air, his face contorted with rage and defeat. The enforcer was unconscious nearby, a trickle of blood running from his temple. Leo didn't release his grip, maintaining the pressure until the Coast Guard arrived, summoned by a frantic call from a passenger who'd witnessed the chaos on the car deck. They secured Vance, cuffing his hands behind his back and hauling him to his feet. "It is over." "Victor," Leo said, his voice hoarse. "It is finally over." Vance didn't respond, his eyes filled with a chilling emptiness. He'd lost everything, torn between his power, his fortune, his carefully constructed facade. The frantic search for Isabella Rossi began immediately. Coast Guard helicopters scoured the choppy waters of Puget Sound, their spotlights slicing through the gathering dusk. Divers plunged into the icy depths, hoping against hope. But time was running out. The currents were strong, the visibility poor. Leo stood on the deck, watching the search, his heart heavy with guilt and despair. He should have been faster. He should have saved her. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over, searching for a different outcome, a way to rewrite the tragedy. But there was none. The hours crawled by each minute in eternity. As darkness descended, the search was called off. The Coast Guard captain offered Leo a grim assessment. The chances of finding Isabella alive were slim to none. He returned to shore, numb with grief and exhaustion. The weight of his failures pressed down on him, almost suffocating. The investigation that followed was thorough and relentless. With Vance in custody, the layers of his criminal empire began to unravel. Leo, working with a team of federal agents, meticulously pieced together the evidence, tracing the flow of money, identifying the key players, and exposing the full extent of Vance's operation. The smuggling ring was far more extensive than Leo had initially imagined. It wasn't just drugs and stolen art. It involved weapons trafficking, human trafficking, and even a conspiracy to destabilize local economies. Vance had cultivated a network of corrupt officials, bribing judges, politicians, and law enforcement officers to look the other way. The truth about Amelia's death emerged slowly, painfully. A forensic accountant working on Vance's financial records discovered a series of payments made to a hitman shortly before the accident. The hitman, when apprehended, confessed to tampering with Amelia's brakes, ensuring the crash would be fatal. Vance had silenced her because she'd discovered the smuggling operation and was threatening to expose him. He'd dismissed her as a naive idealist, an insignificant obstacle. He hadn't anticipated her tenacity, her determination, and he hadn't anticipated Leo. He thought he could get away with it, Leo said to Agent Davies, his voice heavy with emotion. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong, Davies replied, placing a hand on Leo's shoulder. You brought him down, Maxwell. You brought justice to a lot of people. The charges against Vance were numerous and damning: murder, conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, human trafficking. He faced a life sentence, a fitting punishment for a lifetime of greed and cruelty. His empire crumbled around him, his ill-gotten gains seized. His reputation shattered. The trial was a media circus, attracting national attention. Leo testified, recounting the events on the ferry, the struggle, and the devastating loss of Isabella Rossi. He presented the evidence he'd gathered, laying bare Vance's crimes for the world to see. Vance remained defiant throughout the proceedings, maintaining his innocence, blaming others for his downfall. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Leo attended the sentencing, standing in the back of the courtroom, a silent observer. Vance was handed a double life sentence with no possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, he finally met Leo's gaze. There was no remorse, no regret, only a cold, calculating hatred. "This isn't over, Maxwell," Vance said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You haven't heard the last of me." Leo didn't respond. He knew Vance was a dangerous man even behind bars, but he'd neutralized the immediate threat. And that, for now, was enough. Weeks turned into months. Leo returned to his work at the Seattle PD, but he was a changed man. He was quieter, more introspective, haunted by the ghosts of the past. He continued to work on cold cases driven by a renewed sense of purpose. He'd found a small measure of closure, but the pain of losing Isabella and the lingering grief over Amelia remained. Then, one day, an anonymous package arrived at his apartment. It was a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside was a postcard. The image on the postcard showed a pristine beach, turquoise water, and a lush tropical landscape. It was a scene of idyllic beauty, a world away from the gray rain soaked streets of Seattle. On the back of the postcard, a single handwritten sentence. "Fidi, the sun feels good on my skin. Don't look for me, I'm finally free." There was no return address, no signature, just that cryptic message. Leo stared at the postcard, his heart pounding in his chest. It couldn't be Isabella. But the handwriting, it was unmistakably hers. He'd assumed she was lost, swallowed by the cold waters of Puget Sound. He'd mourned her loss, believing she was another victim of Vance's cruelty. But the postcard suggested otherwise. She'd survived somehow. She'd escaped. and she was telling him to leave her alone, to let her start a new life. He looked at the postcard again, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over him. Relief, joy, confusion. A small smile touched his lips. Perhaps, just perhaps, some ghosts could be laid to rest. He carefully placed the postcard on his desk. A silent promise to respect her wishes. He wouldn't look for her. He wouldn't jeopardize her newfound freedom. But he'd never forget her. And he'd always wonder about the woman who survived the darkness, the woman who'd finally found her way to the sun. The postcard sat on Leo's desk for weeks, a small splash of vibrant color in the otherwise muted tones of his apartment. He'd taken to looking at it every morning, tracing the outline of the beach, imagining Isabella bathed in the warm tropical sun. He'd considered sending a reply, a simple acknowledgement, but he'd resisted the urge. Her message had been clear. Don't look for me, I'm finally free. He'd learned, through hard experience, that some doors were better left unopened. Some mysteries were best left unsolved. He'd spent years chasing shadows, unraveling secrets, and sacrificing his own well-being in the process. It was time to let go. The weight of his past, the grief over Amelia, the guilt over Isabella Thuy, it hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, transformed into a dull ache rather than a searing pain. He was learning to live with the ghosts, to accept their presence without being consumed by them. He tendered his resignation from the Seattle PD, surprising many of his colleagues. Reynolds, though outwardly displeased, offered a grudging respect. "You've earned it, Maxwell," he'd said, his voice surprisingly somber. "You've paid your dues." Leo purchased a small cabin on Lopez Island, nestled among the pine trees overlooking a quiet cove. It was a far cry from the bustling city, but it offered the peace and solitude he craved. He spent his days tending a small garden, reading, and walking along the beach, listening to the rhythm of the waves. He allowed himself to reminisce about Amelia, to revisit the memories that had once been too painful to bear. He'd kept her favorite photographs, her letters, her old raincoat. He'd created a small shrine in the cabin, a testament to the love that had been stolen from him. He'd learned to find solace in her absence, to celebrate the life they'd shared rather than mourn its loss. He realized that grief wasn't about forgetting, it was about learning to live with the empty space, to carry the love within your heart. He also found a measure of peace in the knowledge that he'd brought Victor Vance to justice, that he'd exposed his crimes and prevented him from harming others. He'd saved countless people, even if he hadn't saved Isabella. He occasionally thought about Vance, imagining him rotting away in prison, stripped of his power and his arrogance. He didn't feel satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure. One afternoon, as he was tending his garden, he received a visitor, Detective Sarah Chen, a young, eager officer he'd briefly mentored at the precinct. She was working on a cold case, the disappearance of a young hiker in the Olympic National Park. "I was hoping you could take a look at the file, sir," she said, her voice tentative. "I'm stuck. There are no leads, no witnesses. It is like the hiker just vanished into thin air." Leo hesitated for a moment. He'd retired to escape the darkness, to leave the ghost behind. But he couldn't turn his back on someone who needed help. He recognized the same desperation in Chen's eyes that he'd once seen in his own. "Let me see it," he said, guiding her inside. "Sometimes all it takes is a fresh perspective." He spent the next few hours reviewing the file with Chen, offering suggestions, pointing out overlooked details, sharing his experience. He didn't solve the case, but he gave her a renewed sense of purpose, a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, sir," Chen said, as she was leaving. "I really appreciate your help." "Don't thank me," Leo replied. "Just remember to trust your instincts and never give up," as Chen drove away. Leo walked to the ferry terminal, a place he hadn't visited in months. It was a gray, overcast day, the sky heavy with impending rain. The ferry horn blared in the distance, a mournful sound that echoed across the water. He stood at the edge of the pier, watching the fog roll in, shrouding the ferries in a ghostly embrace. It was a familiar sight, a reminder of the darkness he'd faced, the battles he'd fought. He thought about Isabella, about the postcard, about her newfound freedom. He imagined her on a sun-drenched beach, finally at peace. He thought about Amelia, about her unwavering spirit, about the love that would endure beyond the boundaries of time and space. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and allowed himself to feel the weight of his past, the complexity of his emotions. He knew he'd never fully escape the shadows, but he'd learned to live with them, to find meaning in the darkness. The fog swirled around him, obscuring the ferries, blurring the horizon. He stood there for a long time, lost in thought, accepting his past, embracing the present, and looking forward to an uncertain future. He wasn't a hero, or a savior, or a knight in shining armor. He was just a man, flawed and broken, trying to find his way in a world filled with darkness. But he had learned something valuable. He had learned that even in the midst of loss and despair, there was always hope. And that, perhaps, was enough. He had spent his life chasing down villains, but discovered in the end the biggest battle was mastering his own ghosts. The ferry horn sounded once more, a mournful echo in the gathering dusk. Leo turned and walked away, leaving the shadows behind. He carried the echoes with him, but they no longer defined him. He was free.